Welcome to our channel, Hollywood Movie Review. Once Upon a Time in America 1984 Movie Review. Once Upon a Time in America, Italian, Sierra Una Volta in America, is a 1984 epic crime film based on Harry Gray's semi-autobiographical 1952 novel The Hoods. Directed by Sergio Leone from a screenplay he co-wrote with Leonardo Benvenuti, Piero de Bernardi, Enrico Medioli, Franco Arcoli, and Franco Farini. The film stars Robert De Niro, James Woods, Elizabeth McGovern, Joe Pesci, Burt Young, Tuesday Weld, and Treat Williams. The film is an Italian-American venture produced by the Ladd Company, Embassy International Pictures, PSO Enterprises, and La France Cinematografica, and distributed by Warner Brothers. It chronicles the lives of best friends David Noodles Aronson and Maximilian Max Berkovich as they lead a group of Jewish ghetto youths who rise to prominence as Jewish gangsters in New York City's world of organized crime. The film explores themes of childhood friendships, love, lust, greed, betrayal, loss and broken relationships, together with the rise of mobsters in American society. It is the final film in the Once Upon a Time trilogy and also the last film directed by Leone before his death 5 years later, and the first feature film that he had directed in 13 years. It is the third installment of Leone's Once Upon a Time trilogy, which includes Once Upon a Time in the West, 1968, and Duck, You Sucker, 1971. The cinematography is by Tonino Delicali, and the film score by Ennio Morricone. Leone originally envisaged 2 3-hour films, then a single 269-minute, 4 hours and 29 minutes, version, but was convinced by distributors to shorten it to 229 minutes, 3 hours and 49 minutes. The American distributors, the Ladd Company, further shortened it to 139 minutes, 2 hours and 19 minutes, and rearranged the scenes into chronological order, without Leone's involvement. The US edit was a critical and commercial flop in the United States, and critics who had seen both versions harshly condemned the changes made. While sometimes considered one of Leone's most overlooked films, the original European cut of Once Upon a Time in America has remained a critical favorite and frequently appears in lists of the greatest films of all time, especially in the gangster genre. In the 1930s, 3 thugs search for a man named Noodles. Noodles is drugging himself in an opium den with a newspaper next to him featuring the deaths of bootleggers Patrick Goldberg, Philip Stein, and Maximilian Berkovich. He recalls the police removing their corpses, one burnt beyond recognition. Noodles evades capture and leaves the city. In 1918, David Noodles Aronson leads a gang of his 3 friends Patsy Goldberg, Cockeye Stein and Dominic performing jobs for local gangster Bugsy. They meet Max as he foils one of their robberies but has the booty stolen from him by corrupt police officer Whitey. Max joins their gang, and they blackmail Whitey to get the same police protection as Bugsy. The gang becomes successful liquor smugglers. They deposit their earnings in a locker, giving the key to a trusted friend, Mo. Noodles is in love with Mo's sister Deborah, who dreams of becoming a dancer. Due to his socialization as a gangster, Deborah sees no future for their love. Bugsy, now a rival, ambushes the gang and fatally shoots Dominic. Noodles kills Bugsy and is sentenced to prison. When he is released a decade later, Noodles rejoins his gang. During a diamond heist, they use jewelry employee Carol as their informant. She goads Noodles into hitting her to make it look real, after which he rapes her. She soon becomes Max's girlfriend. Noodles realizes that the heist was commissioned by a syndicate figure to eliminate competition. This leads to tensions between Max and Noodles, the latter seeking independence. The gang provides protection for Teamsters Union boss O'Donnell, during the course of which they exchange newborns at a clinic, punishing the head of police, whose wife has just given birth to a boy at that clinic. This results in the police withdrawing their actions against striking workers. Noodles takes Deborah on a lavish date. When she reveals her plans to pursue a career in Hollywood, he snaps and rapes her. As she departs the next day, he attempts to catch a glance of her sitting on the train, but she avoids eye contact. The repeal of prohibition forces the gang to look for alternative activities. Max suggests a New York Federal Reserve Bank heist, which Noodles and Carol deem too risky. Carol convinces Noodles to inform the police about a lesser offense, hoping brief incarceration will cool off Max's ambition. After Noodles calls the police, Max knocks him out. On regaining consciousness, Noodles learns that Max, Patsy, and Cockeye have been killed by the police during the heist, as established at the beginning of the film. A guilt-ridden Noodles hides in the opium den. During his subsequent escape, he realizes that the locker money has disappeared. In the 1960s, after receiving a letter indicating that his identity has been uncovered, Noodles returns to Manhattan for the first time since the 1930s, seeking to find who is responsible. He learns that the bodies of his 3 friends have been relocated to Riverdale. He visits their mausoleum in Riverdale and finds a key to a railway locker. The locker reveals a suitcase full of money, stated to be the advance on his next job. Noodles learns of the corruption scandals around U.S. Secretary of Commerce Christopher Bailey and visits Carol in a retirement home run by the Bailey Foundation. She tells him that Max manipulated them into tipping him off to the police and that Max opened fire first, wishing to die young. In a memorial photograph, Noodles spots Deborah, who has become a major actress, and he starts to suspect a connection between Deborah and Bailey. He tracks down Deborah and visits her, telling her about his invitation to a party at Bailey's mansion, and challenging her to tell him about the mysterious job, as well as the identity of Bailey. Deborah admits to being Bailey's lover and begs Noodles to leave the city before facing hurtful revelations. Ignoring her advice, Noodles leaves her after seeing Bailey's son, who resembles Max when he was younger. Noodles meets Bailey, who turns out to be Max. Noodles learns that Max faked his death, stole the gang's money, and reinvented himself as a self-made businessman. He also made Deborah his mistress, thus robbing Noodles of everything that he had. Faced with ruin due to the corruption scandal, Max reveals that he is behind the mysterious job, which is for Noodles to kill him. Noodles refuses. As Noodles leaves the estate, a garbage truck passes, and a man, presumably Max, walks toward Noodles until the truck passes between them. Noodles sees the truck's auger conveyor grinding garbage, but the man is nowhere to be seen. During the mid-1960s, Sergio Leone had read the novel The Hoods by Harry Gray, a pseudonym for the former gangster-turned-informant whose real name was Harry Goldberg. In 1968, after shooting Once Upon a Time in the West, Leone made many efforts to talk to Gray. Having enjoyed Leone's Dollars trilogy, Gray finally responded and agreed to meet with Leone at a Manhattan bar. Following that initial meeting, Leone met with Gray several times throughout the remainder of the 1960s and 1970s, having discussions with him to understand America through Gray's point of view. Intent on making another trilogy about America consisting of Once Upon a Time in the West, Duck, You Sucker, and Once Upon a Time in America, Leone turned down an offer from Paramount Pictures to direct The Godfather to pursue his pet project. At some point, Leone considered other colleagues including Milos Forman and John Milius for the role of director, with Leone serving merely as producer. For some time, the project was linked to French producers André Genoves and Gérard Libovici, and later to Gaumont, with Gérard Depardieu and Jean Gabin slated to be the main actors. Acquiring the rights to the novel proved to be complicated, as they had been bought by Dan Curtis, who intended to shoot the film and refused various offers by Leone and his backers to sell the rights. Curtis eventually transferred the rights to Alberto Grimaldi in exchange for Grimaldi's production of his $2 million film Burnt Offerings. Initially, only a draft for the film's opening scene was made, penned by Ecobedo Gastaldi and developed by Robert Dylan, which Dylan eventually used in John Frankenheimer's film 99 and 44/100% Dead, much to Leone's dismay. After Grimaldi bought the rights, he felt that he needed an American script writer to faithfully capture the spirit of the novel. He eventually made a deal with Norman Mailer, whose draft greatly disappointed both Grimaldi and Leone, who described Mailer's draft as a Mickey Mouse version of the novel that lacked in structure and made no sense at all. A few elements of Norman Mailer's first two drafts would eventually appear in the film. After Mailer's fiasco, Leone opted for an all-Italian team of script writers. Leonardo Benvenuti and Piero de Bernardi would focus on the 1920s section, Enrico Mediola on the 1930s section, and Franco Kim Arcali on the time shifts, with Leone supervising and Franco Ferrani polishing the script. As of 1975 to 1976, Leone's casting ideas still included Depardieu and Gabin, as well as Richard Dreyfuss as Max, James Cagney, Robert Charlebois, and appearances by Henry Fonda, James Stewart, George Raft and Glenn Ford. In 1976, Ennio Morricone had already composed all the main themes for the film. Meanwhile, relations between Grimaldi and Leone soured, with Grimaldi unconvinced of the film's commercial viability and eventually exiting the project, being replaced in 1980 by Arnon Milchan. At this stage, Leone's casting ideas included Tom Berenger, Dustin Hoffman, Paul Newman, and Liza Minnelli. A 317-page shooting script was completed in late 1981. The final script, translated to English by Stuart M. Kaminsky, was approved by Leone in May 1982. In 1981, at Milchan's suggestion, Leone met Robert De Niro and eventually offered him the role of his choice between Noodles and Max. De Niro's commitment turned out to be crucial for Milchan securing the financial backing for the film. For the role of Max, approximately 200 actors were auditioned. Elizabeth McGovern was chosen for the role of Deborah despite De Niro's request for having a New York native with a Brooklyn accent, due to Leone's appreciation of her performance in Ragtime. Joe Pesci was chosen by Arnon Milchan because of his role in Raging Bull, and was offered a supporting role of his choice. At De Niro's recommendation, Tuesday Weld was cast as Carol, a role that Leone had previously envisioned for Claudia Cardinale. For the children's roles, Leone entrusted the task to Sis Corman, asking her not to have child stars, but instead having actors who had lived in New York's Jewish neighborhood and had no previous acting experience. In the end, Corman provided mostly actors without film credits but with experiences on stage and television. The filming of Once Upon a Time in America started in June 1982 and ended in April the following year. The shooting locations took place in and around the US, Canada, Italy and France, with a focal point in New York City. Interior scenes were filmed mostly at the Cinecittà Studios in Rome. The beach scene in which Max unveils his plan to rob the Federal Reserve, was shot at the Don Cesar in St. Pete Beach, Florida. The railway of New York's Grand Central Terminal in 1930s flashbacks was filmed in the Gare du Nord in Paris. The interiors of the lavish restaurant where Noodles takes Deborah on their date were shot in the Hotel Excelsior in Venice, Italy. Several sequences were filmed in Montreal, Quebec. The exterior of Bordeaux Prison doubled for the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. The shooting of Jimmy O'Donnell was filmed at Place Duville. A scene where Noodles picks up Deborah was shot outside the Ritz-Carlton Montreal. The meeting and shootout with the Minaldi brothers was filmed in the town of Louisville. Filming in New York proved to be relatively difficult, as the IATSE labor union raised a strong objection to Leone's use of a foreign crew, and launched a public protest campaign big enough to persuade President Ronald Reagan to call for a Department of Labor investigation into the matter. De Niro shot his scenes in chronological continuity. His makeup as an old man required 4 to 6 hours of preparation. After a few weeks, Nilo Jacoponi, Manlio Rocchetti, and Gino Zamprioli replaced Christopher Tucker, whose makeup was considered excessive and unrealistic by Leone. By the end of filming, Leone had 10 hours of footage. With his editor Nino Baragli, Leone trimmed it to almost 6 hours, and he originally wanted to release the film in 2 parts. The producers refused, partly because of the commercial and critical failure of Bernardo Bertolucci's 2-part 1900, and Leone was forced to shorten it further. The film was originally 269 minutes, 4 hours and 29 minutes, but when it premiered out of competition at the 1984 Cannes Film Festival, Leone had cut it to 229 minutes, 3 hours and 49 minutes, to appease the distributors. The latter is the version shown in European cinemas. The musical score was composed by Leone's longtime collaborator Ennio Morricone. Deborah's theme was written for a Franco Zeffirelli film but was rejected. The score is also notable for Morricone's incorporation of the music of George Zamfir, who plays a pan flute. Zamfir's flute music was used to similar effect in Peter Weir's Picnic at Hanging Rock, 1975. Morricone also collaborated with vocalist Etta Del Orso on the score. As the film begins and ends in 1933, with Noodles hiding in an opium den from syndicate hitmen, and the last shot of the film is of Noodles in a smiling, opium-soaked high, the film can be interpreted as having been a drug-induced dream, with Noodles remembering his past and envisioning the future. In an interview by Noel Simsalo published in 1987, Leone lent support to this interpretation, saying that the scene set in the 1960s could be seen as an opium dream of Noodles's. In the DVD commentary for the film, film historian and critic Richard Schickel states that opium users often report vivid dreams, and that these visions have a tendency to explore the user's past and future. The ending, in which Max is seen by Noodles outside Bailey's mansion, only to disappear behind a truck as it passes, was reportedly left ambiguous on purpose. James Woods, who played Max, stated that he does not know if Max jumped in the truck or just disappeared. Critic Carlo Affatigato described this twist as a paradox, postulating that the whole film is about how Noodles spends the second half of his life seeking out the truth of what happened, only to discover it, not accept it, and not investigate what happens to Max in the end. Noodles wants only to believe the reality that he has created for himself, not an objective one. Affatigato also believes that this could point to it all being the imagination of Noodles. Many people, including Schickel, assume that the 1968 Frisbee scene, which has an immediate cut and gives no further resolution, was part of a longer sequence. Critic Roger Ebert of the Chicago Sun-Times suggested that the purpose of the flying disc scene was to establish the 1960s time frame and nothing more. Once Upon a Time in America premiered at the 1984 Cannes Film Festival on May 20, 1984. It received a 15-minute standing ovation after the screening. In the United States, a heavily edited version of the film received a wide release in 894 theaters on June 1, 1984, and grossed $2.4 million during its opening weekend. It ended its box office run with a gross of more than $5.3 million on a $30 million budget, and became a box office bomb. Numerous women at the film's premiere reacted furiously, mostly due to the two rape sequences. One woman confronted Robert De Niro at a press conference and made harsh comments to the film's depiction, describing it as blatant, gratuitous violence. In general, the rape scenes specifically were controversial. Richard Gaudin defended Leone's representation of rape, saying that it articulates the dysfunction between bodies in images and bodies themselves. Of the scene in which De Niro's character rapes her character, Elizabeth McGovern said that it didn't glamorize violent sex, it is extremely uncomfortable to watch and it is meant to be. She went on to state, and if you say, this violence is wrong, you'd have to enlarge that to say, all violence in movies is wrong, and then you'd have to say, you can only make movies about good people who obey the law and do right things, which A, excludes a lot of what life is, and B, makes for some very boring movies. In his book, Leone scholar Christopher Frayling argues that the movie's central gang are all emotionally stunted like small boys obsessed with their equipment who have no idea how to relate to flesh and blood women. The film was shown in limited release and for film critics in North America, where it was slightly trimmed to secure an R rating. Cuts were made to two rape scenes and some of the more graphic violence at the beginning. Noodles' meeting with Bailey in 1968 was also excised. The film gained a mediocre reception at several sneak premieres in North America. Because of this early audience reaction, the fear of its length, its graphic violence, and the inability of theaters to have multiple showings in one day, the Lad Company cut entire scenes and removed approximately 90 minutes of the film without the supervision of Sergio Leone. This American-wide release, 1984, 139 minutes, was drastically different from the European release, as the non-chronological story was rearranged into chronological order. Other major cuts involved many of the childhood sequences, making the adult 1933 sections more prominent. Noodles' 1968 meeting with Deborah was excised, and the scene with Bailey ends with him shooting himself, with the sound of a gunshot off-screen, rather than with the garbage truck conclusion of the 229-minute version. Page needed Sergio Leone's daughter Raffaella Leone said that Sergio had dismissed the US version as not his own movie. In the Soviet Union, the film was shown theatrically in the late 1980s, with other Hollywood blockbusters, such as the two King Kong films. The story was rearranged in chronological order, and the film was split in two, with the two parts shown as separate movies, one containing the childhood scenes and the other comprising the adulthood scenes. Despite the rearranging, no major scene deletions were made. In March 2011, it was announced that Leone's original 269-minute version was to be recreated by a film lab in Italy under the supervision of Leone's children, who had acquired the Italian distribution rights, and the film's original sound editor, Fausto Ancilli, for a premiere in 2012 at either the Cannes Film Festival or Venice Film Festival. The restored film premiered at the 2012 Cannes Film Festival, but because of unforeseen rights issues for the deleted scenes, the restoration had a runtime of only 251 minutes. However, Martin Scorsese, whose Film Foundation helped with the restoration, stated that he was helping Leone's children gain the rights to the final 18 minutes of deleted scenes to create a complete restoration of Leone's envisaged 269-minute version. On August 3, 2012, it was reported that after the premiere at Cannes, the restored film was pulled from circulation, pending further restoration work. In North America, a two-tape VHS was released by Warner Home Video in February 1985 and 1991 with a runtime of 226 minutes. The US theatrical cut was also released at the same time in February 1985. A two-disc special edition was released on June 10, 2003, featuring the 229-minute version of the film. This special edition was re-released on January 11, 2011, on both DVD and Blu-ray. On September 30, 2014, Warner Bros. Released a two-disc Blu-ray and DVD set of the 251-minute restoration that was shown at the 2012 Cannes Film Festival, dubbed the Extended Director's Cut. This version was previously released in Italy on September 4, 2012. During its domestic theatrical run, it managed to gross $5.5 million combining both the US and Canadian markets. In Europe, the 229-minute-long version had a relatively better performance, but still didn't manage to recoup the money invested. It sold 1,165,208 admissions in France, becoming the 34th most seen film of the year 198. In Spain, where it was released as a two-parter, the film sold 596,074 admissions, 373,722 and 222,352, respectively, for Part I and Part II. During its initial theatrical run, it was re-released several times for the remainder of the decade, and ended grossing 182 million pesetas, which converted to $1.3 million. The initial critical response to Once Upon a Time in America was mixed, primarily because of the different versions released worldwide. Although the film was well received in its original form internationally, American critics were much more dissatisfied with the 139-minute version that was released in North America. The condensed version was a critical and financial disaster. Some critics compared shortening the film to shortening Richard Wagner's operas, saying that works of art that are meant to be long should be given the respect they deserve. In his 1984 review, Roger Ebert gave the uncut version 4 stars out of 4 and wrote that it was an epic poem of violence and greed, but described the American theatrical version as a travesty. Furthermore, he gave the American theatrical version 1 star out of 4, calling it an incomprehensible mess without texture, timing, mood, or sense. Ebert's television film critic partner Gene Siskel of the Chicago Tribune considered the uncut version to be the best film of 1984 and the shortened, linear studio version to be the worst film of 1984. Vincent Canby of the New York Times criticized the nonlinear narrative that is structured throughout the film. It was only after Leone's death and the subsequent restoration of the original version that critics began to give it the kind of praise displayed at its original Cannes showing. Ebert, in his review of Brian De Palma's The Untouchables, called the original uncut version of Once Upon a Time in America the best film depicting the Prohibition era. James Woods, who considers it to be Leone's finest film, mentioned in the DVD documentary that one critic dubbed the film the worst of 1984, only to see the original cut years later and call it the best of the 1980s. Some were critical towards the movie's graphic violence and cruelty, with Donald Clark of the Irish Times condemning it as a fistful of misogyny and offensively sexist. On the review aggregator website Rotten Tomatoes, Once Upon a Time in America has an approval rating of 86% based on 56 reviews. The website's critic consensus reads, Sergio Leone's epic crime drama is visually stunning, stylistically bold, and emotionally haunting, and filled with great performances from the likes of Robert De Niro and James Woods. On Metacritic, the film has a weighted average score of 75 out of 100 based on reviews from 20 critics, indicating generally favorable reviews. The film has been ranked as one of the best films of the gangster genre. In Empire magazine, critic Adam Smith compared the film favorably to The Godfather, saying, Leone's film is arguably the better of the two, if the less popular, eschewing, as it does, the soapy melodramatics of Coppola's family saga in favor of less audience-friendly, but more intriguing, ambiguity and symbolism. When Sight and Sound asked several UK critics in 2002 what their favourite films of the last 25 years were, Once Upon a Time in America placed at number 10. In 2015, the film was ranked at number 9 on Time Out's list of the 50 best gangster films of all time, while in 2021, The Guardian cited it as the 4th greatest mobster film ever made. In 2023, the AV Club ranked it 7th in its list of the greatest gangster movies of all time. Unlike its modern critical success, the initial American release did not fare well with critics and received no Academy Award nominations. The film's music was disqualified from Oscar consideration for a technicality, as the studio accidentally omitted the composer's name from the opening credits when trimming its running time for the American release. Based on Harry Gray's novel The Hoods, it chronicles the lives of best friends David Noodles Aronson and Maximilian Max Berkovich as they lead a group of Jewish ghetto youths who rise to prominence as Jewish gangsters in New York City's world of organized crime. Being stuck in bed recuperating after a hospital stay made me decide to finally watch this almost 4-hour epic, because what the hell else was I going to do with my time? It's also a part of my IMDb Top 250 challenge, so it gets another movie crossed off of that list. I admit that I didn't love this one, but the gangster film genre has never been a favorite of mine. I did think The Godfather I and 2 were good, but have had no desire to rewatch them. And I've never even watched Casino because the violence in that sounds far too extreme for me. So I'm admittedly not the best audience for this film, which was also very violent and, way more rape-y than I was expecting. This won't pass the Bechdel test. But I don't believe in art being forced to follow some bullshit rules. This is just a warning that women aren't treated well in this film, but it's probably an accurate representation of these violent sort of men with no morals. I did appreciate how much time was spent showing us De Niro's character's past, and liked the part of the film focusing on his childhood and his criminal friends the most. And, hey, Brian Bloom was in this as one of his childhood friends. He was a heartthrob in all the teen magazines I bought in the 80s, but I knew absolutely nothing he'd actually starred in. I should point out that he was also in the ridiculous horror comedy The Stuff, which was horribly bad but is more my type of thing than gangster films. You almost started to care about these guys after seeing them grow up together and somehow stay loyal to each other as they became partners in crime. Almost. The characters were all truly horrible human beings, and I struggle with films that have no sympathetic characters. Actually, Fat Mo was okay. Yay, Fat Mo. He was kind of likable. Unfortunately, De Niro lost any sympathy I may have had for his character after his final date with the girl he claimed to love, played by Elizabeth McGovern. Sorry for the negative sounding review. This is, admittedly, a very good and well-made film. Sergio Leone was a brilliant filmmaker. Oh, and this once again had an Ennio Morricone score. Of course. So I was very happy about that, as I'm a big fan. I should point out that I really like Leone's Dollars trilogy, especially The Good, The Bad, and The Ugly, and also far preferred Once Upon a Time in the West to In America. And those certainly aren't passing some stupid test gauging how female characters are treated either, they're just much more my style, and I think they're damn good films. Was hoping to like this one as much as those, but do think this is as good as all the best of the gangster films that have been made. When I'm asked what my favorite films are, there are usually three answers I give: 2001, A Space Odyssey, 1968, a spectacle of probing science fiction with a touch of ominous mystery. The Thin Red Line, 1998, which combines terrifying sequences from the Guadalcanal campaign in World War II with existentialist themes in an avant-garde style. And the third film I always recommend is Once Upon a Time in America. There are simply very few films superior to Sergio Leone's masterpiece. It encapsulates everything that makes cinema such a captivating medium, both in its visual splendor and in its unique capacity for storytelling. The film boasts rich, multifaceted characters. The editing evokes the workings of the subconscious mind, while the cinematography allows us to traverse time seamlessly. And Ennio Morricone's score is amongst the most beautiful I've ever encountered. The story chronicles the lives of 5 friends throughout their pursuit of fortune and notoriety in Prohibition-era New York. Our tale opens in 1923, with David Aronson, Scott Tyler, known by the nickname Noodles, trying to make his mark on the crime-ridden streets of Manhattan's Lower East Side. Along with his friends Maximilian Max Berkovich, Rusty Jacobs, Philip Cockeye Stein, Adrian Curran, Patrick Patsy Goldberg, Brian Bloom, and Dominic, Noah Mose, the gang chases the American dream. As they soon discover, life is full of unforeseen pitfalls. When Noodles, now played by Robert De Niro, is released from prison in 1931, their destinies have already been forged. They are now grown men, determined to become the top bootleggers in the business. Max, James Woods, is running the show, while Patsy, James Hayden, and Cockeye, William Forsythe, serve as loyal members of their quartet. But it soon becomes clear that these childhood friends cannot remain so forever. 35 years after escaping New York amid a catastrophic event, Noodles returns from his self-imposed exile. He's keen to discover who stole the $1 million the gang had stashed away, and who sent him an ominous letter, bidding him to return. When questioned about the message, he replies, "It means, Noodles, though you've been hiding in the asshole of the world, we found you. We know where you are. It means, get ready." There's something utterly ethereal about this classic 1984 film. Sergio Leone conjures a magical, tragically poignant atmosphere, turning the work into an epic exploration of dreams, memory, regret, time, poverty, desperation, power, and the American dream. It's also a fascinating example of a coming-of-age story where the protagonists never mature, all of them are, in some way, trapped by the past. The result is a wholly unique film, unlike anything I've seen since I first watched it as a teenager. How does one begin an epic of such magnitude? A film conceived as a 6-hour experience needs a momentous starting point, and Leone delivers precisely that. This 4-hour odyssey commences at the very moment Noodles' life unravels. We are plunged into a scene of violence, witnessing the brutalization and murder of his friends and lovers. The reasons for this shocking display remain tantalizingly unclear. It's a gripping start to a patient film. Leone wisely begins in medias res, understanding that there's a long story ahead. The Italian filmmaker throws the audience into the middle of the action, with some pre-existing conflict to keep us hooked. In this respect, it's practically Shakespearean. However, due to Leone's non-linear narrative, he has essentially placed us at the climax. The end of Act 4 in a Shakespearean play is typically associated with the protagonist's downfall. This is telling, to say the least. By doing this, Leone already gives us a great deal of insight into the story's themes. Most importantly, we're shown the consequences of one man's chase for the American dream. While Noodles and Max might have begun with good intentions to escape poverty, become wealthy, and achieve everything they ever desired, they become utterly ruthless in trying to obtain that which exceeds their grasp. Leone seemingly offers a very subtle critique of the society that has instilled these boys with such dreams, a society that simultaneously denies them the legitimate means to achieve their goals. Even as preteens, they're aware that the path to rapid advancement lies in becoming the most cunning criminal on the streets, setting fire to a newspaper stand, rolling a drunk, or striking a shady deal with the police. All their exploits become a mere means to an end. Since the boys seemingly lack any parental figure in their lives, they hurtle down this path unhindered. As a result, their borderline psychopathic behavior becomes the norm for them. This is precisely what has allowed them to emerge from their adolescence as anything more than petty criminals. Leone seems to suggest that, in the pursuit of the American dream, a moral compass becomes nothing more than a hindrance. The rewards of criminality incentivize ruthlessness, they all benefit from their violent behavior. This makes our protagonists a collection of complicated characters. Desperate to grow up, become men, and carve out a niche for themselves in life, they remain oblivious to the pain and suffering they cause. As a result, there's nothing they wouldn't do. Does this make them bad people? Well, yes. Yet, we still find ourselves empathizing with them. I have questioned why we still identify with these characters even after watching them commit heinous crimes. Is this just the power of masterful filmmaking, capable of making us understand even when we don't condone or forgive? Leone invites you to see their humanity, even after showing you the darkest depths of their dysfunction. It seems to me that, as Leone romanticizes his characters, we can't help but romanticize them as well. Perhaps it's how our characters embody the rapid growth of America, a young nation that soon found itself wielding immense power. As Max observes, this country's still growing up. Some diseases you're better off having when you're still young. What disease is Leone referring to? The rampant corruption that's ingrained in achieving the American dream, the merciless violence and burning greed that lurks beneath the very thin veneer of success. Leone's film chronicles the emergence of a new world, a frightening, unformed place. Tellingly, those who are shaping it do so without a conscience. Our protagonists are like virulent weeds, a virus that binds to its host before it can defend itself. Even the title of the film suggests this. It implies that a dark acquisitiveness has been present from the very foundation of the nation, pervading it ever since. This is a theme present in Francis Ford Coppola's The Godfather, 1972, and Martin Scorsese's Goodfellas, 1990. Once Upon a Time in America finds itself set apart from these two classics in several ways, however. Firstly, Leone's film is far more melancholic than either of the aforementioned gangster flicks. While Henry Hill concludes with a monologue brimming with disdain for the ordinary life he leads, a stark contrast to his days as a flamboyant gangster celebrity, Noodles is consumed by a deep sense of regret. Perhaps for the wrong reasons, he appears less concerned about those he has harmed than the impact it's had on his own life, but regretful he remains nonetheless. Secondly, Leone's film offers a more nuanced perspective on masculinity than is present in The Godfather or Goodfellas. Both Noodles and, especially, Max, demonstrate a disturbing inability to regulate their emotions. This was perhaps unsurprising in 1920s America. However, it remains interesting how their emotional fragility is often linked to a desire to evince their inviolable masculinity, in all its heartless, callous glory. In this way, Leone inextricably links their insecurities with wanton acts of cruelty, all fueled by a woeful lack of emotional intelligence. Having said all this, it would be a mistake to characterize our protagonists as unfeeling monsters. They perhaps come across more as being out of their depth, like children trying to stay ahead of the game. Entering the rat race at such a young age, their sole ambition was simply to get a good start. As Noodles melancholically reflects, you can always tell the winners at the starting gate. You can always tell the winners, and you can tell the losers. When his old friend, Fat Mo, Larry Rapp, cheerfully assures him, "I'd have put everything I ever had on you," Noodles replies solemnly, "Yeah. And you would have lost." He knows now, all too late, that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Now, he wonders if their intentions were ever good in the first place. Leone's masterpiece prominently features themes of the past, our memories of it, and the regret it evokes. Noodles involuntarily remembers a significant moment in his life whenever he sees or hears something. This imbues the film with a Proustian quality. It often feels as though Noodles is not truly searching for the truth behind the letter he receives, but rather for a vague, undefined moment of past happiness. Did such a time even exist? He cannot be certain. As Deborah, Elizabeth McGovern, mournfully states, "All that we have left now are our memories." Unfortunately, even memories can't be trusted. Indeed, Leone's drama is less a crime flick than an exploration of the human condition. Unlike other crime films, gangster action is largely eschewed in favor of a more introspective tone. The film often feels like a collection of vignettes, the formative events that turn these boys into the dysfunctional men they become. Some of these moments are charmingly sweet. As a preteen, Patsy sits on the stairs waiting for Peggy, Julie Cohen, a young prostitute who will offer her services in exchange for a cupcake topped with a strawberry, nestled in a sea of whipped cream. However, the anxious boy's nascent manhood isn't yet strong enough to restrain his childish impulses. Seized by the allure of the sweet treat, he devours it on the stairs before Peggy can even emerge from her room. These intimate glimpses into their youthful innocence, an innocence that will be stripped away by their violent actions, serve to humanize the characters. My favorite scene in the whole film comes in one of these quiet moments. When Noodles is released from prison, he sees Deborah again for the first time in 8 years. She's the light in his life that's kept him going, and it's clear in De Niro's eyes. Deborah tells him she dances every night, inviting him to watch her perform if he ever has the time. He smiles. Every night, he assures her. As Leone allows these scenes to unfold at a steady, unhurried pace, we are utterly captivated by the film's magic. Though it may be 4 hours long, it certainly doesn't feel that way. This is because Leone imparts a genuine sense of having lived a life, of having experienced these moments with profound emotional intensity. Some of these moments will fade from memory, some may even have been figments of our imagination. But others will undoubtedly haunt us forever. Leaning on themes of memory and regret, Leone skillfully weaves the concept of fate into the narrative. The number 35 appears ominously throughout the film. When Noodles and Max first meet, the stolen pocket watch reads 6:35. Noodles then disappears and lives a new life for 35 years. Intriguingly, both the first and final meetings between Noodles and Max are punctuated by a vehicle coming between them, the work of fate, perhaps. It certainly seems so. In their final encounter, a number 35 is scrawled on the side of the garbage truck that will ultimately obscure Max from Noodles' view. The significance of this number remains a mystery. Finally, idealization emerges as a prominent theme in the story. This is most clearly seen in Noodles' deification of Deborah, who becomes less of a person in his eyes and more like a celestial object, she is his Donna Angelica, the Beatrice to his Dante. However, despite his impassioned declarations of love, Deborah sees straight through Noodle's misguided and hopeless devotion. "You'd lock me up and throw away the key," she accuses, a statement he cannot deny. It also leads to the film's most notorious scene, after Deborah informs Noodles that she's leaving New York to pursue stardom in California, he rapes her in the back of their cab. The scene is so shocking that it has led many to dismiss the entire film as misogynistic schlock. This characterization is one that McGovern strongly disagrees with. "It didn't glamorous violent sex," she said. "It is extremely uncomfortable to watch and it is meant to be. I imagine many viewers were so appalled by the scene because, up to this point, we've been rather complicit in the on-screen violence. I doubt many watched the gunfights with the same horror, at least. One explanation for this could be that we're witnessing Noodles and his associates murdering corrupt police officers and gangsters. But then again, violence is violence. These are men who ruthlessly take what doesn't belong to them. We've identified with them until we're jolted into awareness. We feel a sense of betrayal for having empathized with dangerous men. However, this dynamic also makes for a far more interesting film. After all, why should our protagonists be morally unambiguous? Few people in real life truly are. McGovern alludes to this point too. If you say, "This violence is wrong," you'd have to enlarge that to say, "All violence in movies is wrong," and then you'd have to say, "You can only make movies about good people who obey the law and do right things," which, A, excludes a lot of what life is and, B, makes for some very boring movies. I concur with McGovern. Part of what makes Once Upon a Time in America such a riveting story is the complexity of the characters on screen. This isn't to say that murder, rape, or child abduction are ethically vague. They are all abhorrent atrocities. However, by embedding us so deeply in the lives of our protagonists, Leone compels us to grapple with the characters we've come to know so well. In presenting us with the terrible potential humans possess, he denies us a bland viewing experience. This is just one of the many reasons behind the film's artistic success. Unfortunately, the film wasn't a commercial success, although this wasn't in any way due to its quality. In fact, it was a critical darling. After filming was completed, the footage ran for roughly 10 hours. Leone initially envisioned this being edited into 2 3-hour films. However, when the producers refused this idea, Leone adapted his vision to create a single, 229-minute film, which was met with great acclaim at Cannes. Unfortunately, the film encountered further difficulties in reaching American audiences. The Ladd Company, the film's U.S. distributor, made significant cuts without director Sergio Leone's approval or involvement. This reduced the running time to a mere 2 hours and 20 minutes. More concerning, they also restructured the film, abandoning its nonlinear narrative for a more conventional chronological order. The result was an incomprehensible mess. This version was panned upon release and is credited with ruining the film's reputation for years. It was only years later, when audiences witnessed the awe-inspiring 4-hour director's cut on video, that Leone's brilliance began to be truly appreciated. This belated adulation seems to contradict Ridley Scott's recent claim that audiences have no appetite for films exceeding 2.5 hours. Perhaps Scott has misjudged the situation. Audiences, it seems, weren't averse to a 4-hour epic as long as it was Leone's masterpiece. After all, when a film is as magnificent as Leone's magnum opus, length becomes a secondary concern. Considering his standing in popular culture, it's surprising to think that Sergio Leone only directed 7 films. The iconic Man with No Name trilogy, 1964-66, and Once Upon a Time in the West, 1968, alone account for 4 of his filmmaking ventures. His directorial debut, The Colossus of Rhodes, 1961, a critical and commercial flop, has faded into the obscurity of history. Meanwhile, his criminally underrated Duck, You Sucker, 1971, is seldom mentioned. Although he had a multitude of unrealistic projects, Once Upon a Time in America was to be Leone's final film. It feels rather fitting. Leone imbues the work with a meditative melancholy, creating a yearning for lost youth. While he intersperses moments of sadness with bursts of intense tension, Noodles tightening his grip on his suitcase while glancing over his shoulder never fails to make me hold my breath. The overall tone is mournful, introspective, and pensive. Undeniably, the music of the great Ennio Morricone hugely enhances this film. While his score for The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, 1966, is likely his most recognizable work, it's even been inducted into the Grammy Hall of Fame, I would argue that this is his finest contribution to cinema. The pan flute becomes a mesmerizing leitmotif, while Deborah's theme is a harrowing melody. Perhaps it's only rivaled by his love theme for Natalia from the sublime Cinema Paradiso, 1988, but that's just nitpicking at this stage. The writing team behind the adaptation of Harry Gray's novel, The Hoods, also deserves recognition. Leonardo Benvenuti, Piero de Bernardi, Enrico Mediola, Franco Arcoli, Franco Farini, and Sergio Leone all played a part in transforming the original story into a hefty screenplay. Together, they effortlessly develop each character on screen. Their 317-page script subtly conveys the passage of time through dialogue, eschewing the need for large, intrusive timestamps. Plot information is revealed organically, without the viewer even realizing it, a testament to the script's lack of jarring exposition. There's an expression that describes how there are three versions of every film: the one that exists on the page, the one that's filmed, and the final work painstakingly crafted in the editing suite. This statement couldn't be truer for Leone's masterpiece. Over an entire year, he and editor Nino Baragli crafted an interwoven triptych, where boundaries of time and space completely melt away. The ringing of a telephone is all they need to move across the narrative, showcasing the true power of cinema as an art form. Poetic visual matches facilitate these leaps across time. A peephole, or smoke curling from a vent, becomes an opportunity to teleport Noodles to a different period in his life. It's a noteworthy stylistic choice that Leone forgoes timestamps. He trusts his audience to be drawn into Noodles' memory. Leone seems to grasp that we might be unsure of exactly when these formative moments transpired in our own lives. All we can know for sure is that they happened, or can we even be certain of that? There's a great deal of ambiguity concerning the truth of Noodles' perspective. After all, he's a former opium addict. Certain sequences have a dreamlike quality, leading us to question, how much of this story is real? How much of it is a drug-induced fantasy? Could the scenes set in 1968 all be figments of his imagination? The fact that we first encounter Noodles in a dingy opium den, with the film's final scene returning to this moment, hints that we might be trapped within a boundless dream. In this dreamlike reality, Noodles is free from the burden of regret. In this respect, Leone's Once Upon a Time in America is reminiscent of John Steinbeck's The Winter of Our Discontent, 1961. Both narratives feature protagonists who dream of striking it rich, with each man attempting to achieve wealth through immoral methods. However, both our heroes are haunted by the path they take, and the money they amass becomes worthless. Consumed by guilt and regret, they yearn for escape. Why else would one of the richest men in New York reside in the squalor of an opium den? It is only there that he can truly live out his dreams, a stark contrast to the ruinous life he has built for himself. In John Steinbeck's novel, protagonist Ethan Allen Hawley declares, "People who are most afraid of their dreams convince themselves they don't dream at all." Noodles, however, has twisted his dreams into a tangible reality, one he now desperately tries to convince himself is a mere illusion. To escape his self-inflicted misery, he must rediscover the power of dreaming, supplanting the real world with a pleasant fiction. This is arguably the most haunting element of Leone's film. The characters we've come to know so deeply become shells. Ghosts. Phantoms that belong to the past. They've emptied themselves of their humanity and scooped out their innocence for the promise of a prosperous future away from the streets. Only years later will they all realize that they were happiest, and most human, when they were boys. Leone's final film encapsulates everything I adore about cinema. It brims with emotion, complex characters, and weighty themes. It offers a detailed examination of a life squandered. Intelligent writing, masterful editing, and skillful cinematography all coalesce to convey the ineffable, transient experiences that shape the human condition. Perhaps, above all else, it's the ending. An odyssey as long as this one can be captured in a single image, a man's smile. A smile for a life he lived and half imagined, a smile for loves he never truly knew, and a smile for the friends he has lost, the boys he can only see again in his dreams. This was a murdered movie, now brought back to life on home video. Sergio Leone's Once Upon a Time in America, which in its intended 227-minute version is an epic poem of violence and greed, was chopped by 90 minutes for US theatrical release into an incomprehensible mess without texture, timing, mood, or sense. The rest of the world saw the original film, which I saw at the Cannes Film Festival. In America, a tragic decision was made. When the full-length version, now available in cassette form, played at the 1984 Cannes Film Festival, I wrote, "Is the film too long?" Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that it takes real concentration to understand Leone's story construction, in which everything may or may not be an opium dream, a nightmare, a memory, or a flashback, and that we have to keep track of characters and relationships over 50 years. No, in the sense that the movie is compulsively and continuously watchable and that the audience did not stir or grow restless as the epic unfolded. The movie tells the story of 5 decades in the lives of 4 gangsters from New York City, childhood friends who are merciless criminals almost from the first, but who have a special bond of loyalty to each other. When one of them breaks that bond, or thinks he does, he is haunted by guilt until late in his life, when he discovers that he was not the betrayer but the betrayed. Leone's original version tells this story in a complex series of flashbacks, memories, and dreams. The film opens with 2 scenes of terrifying violence, moves to an opium den where the Robert De Niro character is seeking to escape the consequences of his action, and then establishes its tone with a scene of great power, a ceaselessly ringing telephone, ringing forever in the conscience of a man who called the cops and betrayed his friends. The film moves back and forth in a tapestry of episodes, which all fit together into an emotional whole. There are times when we don't understand exactly what is happening, but never a time when we don't feel confidence in the film's narrative. That version was not seen in American theaters, although it is now available on cassette and DVD. Instead, the whole structure of flashbacks was junked. The telephone rings once. The poetic transitions are gone. The movie has been wrenched into apparent chronological order, scenes have been thrown out by the handful, relationships are now inexplicable, and the audience is likely to spend much of its time in complete bewilderment. It is a great irony that this botched editing job was intended to clarify the film. Here are some of the specific problems with the shortened version. A speakeasy scene comes before a newspaper headline announces that prohibition has been ratified. Prohibition is then repealed, on what feels like the next day but must be 6 years later. 2 gangsters talk about robbing a bank in front of a woman who has never been seen before in the film, they've removed the scene explaining who she is. A labor leader turns up, unexplained, and involves the gangsters in an inexplicable situation. He later sells out, but to whom? Men come to kill De Niro's girlfriend, a character we've hardly met, and we don't know if they come from the mob or the police. And here's a real howler, at the end of the shortened version, De Niro leaves a room he has never seen before by walking through a secret panel in the wall. How did he know it was there? In the long version, he was told it was there. In the short version, his startling exit shows simple contempt for the audience. Many of the film's most beautiful shots are missing from the short version, among them a bravura moment when a flash-forward is signaled by the unexpected appearance of a frisbee, and another where the past becomes the present as the Beatles' Yesterday sneaks into the soundtrack. Relationships are truncated, scenes are squeezed of life, and I defy anyone to understand the plot of the short version. The original Once Upon a Time in America gets a 4-star rating. The shorter version is a travesty. If you were, like me, thoroughly absorbed by Martin Scorsese's recent directorial gangster epic, The Irishman, 2019, you should definitely check out another incredible gangster drama, Once Upon a Time in America, 1984. It is directed by acclaimed Italian filmmaker, Sergio Leone, he of spaghetti western fame. Indeed, Once Upon a Time in America, 1984, was the first feature film he'd made since A Fistful of Dynamite, 1971. Sadly, it was to be his final film. With the director's cut running at a behemoth 250 minutes and original theatrical release lasting 229 minutes, Once Upon a Time in America, 1984, is certainly a marathon viewing experience and fitting epitaph to Leone's cinematic craft. Yet, the film rarely feels overlong or slow because there are so many memorable scenes, fascinatingly complex characterizations, incredible intrigue, and enough narrative density present to satisfy any audience member with the patience to let it absorb you. Structurally, the film is epic in nature too, as it crosscuts between 3, arguably 4, separate timelines in 1918, the 1920s, the 1930s and 1968. Interestingly, I watched it via Amazon Prime in 2 sittings and is so long even the original intermission card remains. Leone and his amazing production cast and crew took almost a year to film Once Upon a Time in America, 1984. It's reported to have had somewhere between 8 to 10 hours of footage on completion. He originally wanted to release it as a 2-part epic, but the studio insisted it was distributed as one film. The almost 4-hour theatrical release was received to great critical acclaim in Europe. However, a severely chopped down 139-minute version was put out in America. It was a critical and box office bomb. American critics, however, lauded the European version, lamenting the non-release of Leone's full cinematic vision. For a filmmaker who was drawn to stories set in the America, Leone would generally film in European studios and locations. While some exteriors for Once Upon a Time in America, 1984, were shot on location in Florida and New York, many of the interiors were recreated in Rome Cinecittà. Furthermore, a Manhattan restaurant was built in Venice, and incredibly, Grand Central Station was rendered at part of the Gare du Nord in Paris. Having said that, Once Upon a Time in America, 1984, is so carefully and exquisitely designed and filmed, you would not notice. While possessing more than an air of European Arthur's sensibilities, the film, based on a novel called The Hoods, represents Leone's and his co-screenwriters' tarnished vision of the American dream. Most significantly is the theme of a loss of innocence. 1920s New York is presented through the eyes of these Jewish working-class children, many of them sons and daughter of migrants from Europe. These are tough times, and the story explores the collision between young innocence and adult corruption by society and humanity. Once Upon a Time in America, 1984, is also a story about friendship, loyalty, passion, and crime. The narrative revolves around the lives of young gang of Jewish friends growing up in Brooklyn called Noodles, Max, Patsy, Cockeye and Little Dominic. It's majestic storytelling of the highest quality as we flit between past, present, now and future. Robert De Niro's older Noodles reminisces both from 1930 and 1968. There is a sense that he may be projecting from the hazy and drug-addled glow of an opium den. That is open to interpretation though. Thematically, the framework hangs a history of childhood friendships, juxtaposing it with the same people as adults and their victories, losses, and betrayals. Further themes include love, lust, greed, crime, broken relationships, prohibition, union corruption, as well as focusing on the rise of mobsters in American society. Noodles, as portrayed by an imperious Robert De Niro, is calm on the outside. However, his often rash actions show him as impetuous, emotional, and wild on the inside. James Woods Max is much more careful, calculating, and ice-cold in his business. But the two forge a friendship as teenagers which continues in adulthood. Their childhood gang subsequently becomes a renowned bootlegging and criminal outfit. Leone does not ask us to like or find sympathy for the characters, but rather respect that they are a product of a ruthless era. Sure, they could have got day jobs, but they decide to become criminals, and very successful they are too. Even after Noodles gets out of jail for killing a rival, Max has saved a place for him in their illegal liquor trades. Only later does the true deception occur. Ultimately, while their stories are incredibly compelling, these men are violent lawbreakers who spill blood, bribe, threaten, kill and rape, all in an attempt to rise up the ladder of the American capitalist system. I don't want to spoil any more of the story, but safe to say the cast in this classic film are amazing. Along with De Niro and Wood's brutally convincing performances, a whole host of young and older actors are directed beautifully by Leone's careful hand. The standouts for me are Jennifer Connelly in a very early role. She portrays the younger Deborah, while Elizabeth McGovern is the older version of the same character. Connelly is a picture of angelic innocence, and Noodles is smitten with her from the beginning. It's sad therefore that when the adult Noodles is rejected by Deborah, his reaction is both toxic and unforgivable. Undeniably, sex and violence are powerful features in Once Upon a Time in America, 1984. Sex especially is rarely, if at all, romantic or part of loving relationship. There are two brutal rape scenes in the adult years. Even when they are kids, the character of younger Peggy is shown to use her promiscuity as a weapon to blackmail a police officer. There are some tender moments though, notably during the scene where young Patsy seeks to lose his virginity with Peggy. Her payment would be a cream cake, but Brian eats the cake and saves his innocence. Yet such scenes are fleeting as mob rule, violent robberies, fiery death, and murder ultimately dominate the characters' bloody existences. As I say, the actors all give memorable performances, and the supporting cast including the likes of Treat Williams, Danny Aiello, Tuesday Weld, and Joe Pesci are extremely strong too. A special mention to James Hayden, who portrays the older Patsy. He doesn't have the most dialogue compared to the characters of Max and Noodles, however, he has a quiet power which steals many scenes via strength of personality. The fact that Hayden died of a heroin overdose, in 1983, after completing filming only adds to the cult of tragedy. Dead at 30 years of age, James Hayden never got to see any completed version of Once Upon a Time in America, 1984. Given this review is getting near epic proportions itself, I will begin to wrap up by heaping praise on the incredible production design. The costumes, locations, vehicles, props, and era are slavishly and beautifully recreated. So much so you can almost smell the smoke as it drifts up from the Brooklyn streets. Moreover, the film is superbly photographed by Tonino Delli. The music. I haven't even mentioned the sumptuous score by the legendary Ennio Morricone. His score is a masterful symphony of haunting laments for loss of love, friendship, loyalty, and life. Much indeed like Once Upon a Time in America, 1984, itself, as a whole. In conclusion, if you haven't seen it, I urge you to do so in the knowledge that Sergio Leone has transplanted that same brutally elegant vision of the Wild West to the American gangster genre with unforgettable emotional resonance and power. When Sergio Leone's epic Once Upon a Time in America opened here in June, 1984, in a studio hacked-down version, cut from 3 hours and 47 minutes to 2 hours and 15 minutes, it seemed so incoherently bad that I didn't see how the full-length film could be anything but longer. A few weeks later, though, the studio people let me look at it, and I was amazed at the difference. I don't believe I've ever seen a worse case of mutilation. In the full version, the plot, which spans almost a half-century, was still somewhat shaky, but Robert De Niro's performance as the Jewish gangster, Noodles, took hold, and the picture had a dreamy obsessiveness. I was excited about it and expected to review it a few weeks later, when it was to be released. But the opening was postponed, the weeks stretched into months, and by the time the full, or reasonably complete, Epic showed at the New York Film Festival and began slipping into a few theaters. Other films were making a more urgent claim. There's a special reason it lacked urgency. Like the rest of Sergio Leone's work, Once Upon a Time in America has no immediacy, no present tense. And being in many ways a culmination of his career, it's probably the least anchored of his films. Leone, who grew up in the Italian studio world, his father, Vincenzo Leone, was a pioneer director, isn't interested in observing the actual world. It probably seems too small and confining. He's involved in his childhood fixations about movies, stories enlarged, simplified, mythicized. He only makes epics. There's no irony in the title. He uproots American westerns and gangster pictures and turns them into fairy tales and fantasies. In this movie, a Jewish deli on the Lower East Side in 1921 is on a street as broad as Park Avenue and has a storeroom the size of a football field. Leone doesn't care about the fact that it was the crowded, constricting buildings that drove the kids into the streets. He directs as if he had all the time in the world, and he has no interest in making his characters lifelike. He inflates their gestures and slows down their actions. Every lick of the lips is important. After we've seen conventional gangster pictures, the characters may become enlarged in our memories because of what they do and how the actors look as they're doing it. Leone doesn't bother to develop the characters to him, they're mythic as soon as he puts them on the screen. And in this movie, though he gives almost an hour to the childhood years of his gang of 6 Jewish boys, and a couple of girls, the camera solemnizes and celebrates these kids of 10 and 12 and 14 from the start. It's like watching the flamboyant childhood of the gods. In a sense, what Leone gives us is predigested reveries. It's escapism at a further remove, a dream-begotten dream, but a feverish one, intensified by sadism, irrational passions, vengeance, and operatic savagery. In the genre he created, the spaghetti western, the protagonist didn't wait for his enemies to draw, he shot first. Leone has found the right metaphor here. The movie begins and ends in an opium den, where Noodles puffs on a pipe while episodes of his life of killings and rapes and massacres drift by and a telephone rings somewhere in the past. The action is set in 1921, 1933, and 1968, but not in that order. In its full length, the movie has a title pull back toward the earliest memories, and an elegiac tone. Partly, I think, this is the result of De Niro's measured performance. He makes you feel the weight of Noodles' early experiences and his disappointment in himself. He makes you feel that Noodles never forgets the past, and it's his all-encompassing guilt that holds the film's different sections together. De Niro was offered his choice of the 2 leading roles: Max, the go-getter, the tricky, hothead boss of the group, and the watchful, indecisive Noodles, the loser, who spends the years from 1921 to 1933 in prison. I respect De Niro's decision, because he may have thought that the passive Noodles, whose urges explode in bursts of aggression against women, would be a reach, would test him. But I think he made a mistake in terms of what was best for the movie, which, despite its hypnotic bravura, lacks the force at its center that a somewhere between $21 and $45 million epic, depending on who is asked, needs. James Woods, who plays Max, dominated the short version. He actually provided its brighter moments, and it's a sad thing when you go to a movie and look forward to seeing James Woods, whose specialty is acting feral. In the full version, De Niro gives the film its dimensions. He keeps a tiny flame alive in his eyes, and his performance builds, but Leone doesn't provide what seems essential, a collision between Noodles and Max, or, at least, some development of the psychosexual tensions that are hinted at. When Noodles and Max are young teenagers and are murderously beaten by a rival gang, Noodles lies writhing and Max crawls toward him. It's like Jennifer Jones and Gregory Peck at the end of Duel in the Sunday. The film's theme is the betrayal of the immigrant's dream of America. Max, ever greedy for more money, more power, represents the betrayer. By leaving the 2 men's competition and love-hate as just an undercurrent, the film chokes off its dramatic core. And Noodles often seems to be contemplating his life instead of living it. He's at his most assured he comes into his own when Noodles is about 60, there's something old about him from the start. No one is less likely to be called Noodles. Leone wants the characters to be as big as the characters he saw on the screen when he was a child, and he tries to produce that effect with looming close-ups and heroic gestures. The key thing for his actors is to have the right look. Yet, despite his having breathed and talked this movie for almost 10 years before he started production, he made some flagrant mistakes when he got down to the casting. After you've seen his Once Upon a Time in the West, you can't get the iconographic faces, Henry Fonda, Charles Bronson, Jason Robards, Woody Strode, Claudia Cardinale, Jack Elam, and all the others, out of your mind. But it's almost impossible to visualize all of the 5 adult gang members in America, even right after you've seen the movie. Worse, they don't have the basic movie gangster characteristic, they don't emanate danger. And although Deborah, the dancer actress that Noodles loves all his life, is marvelously vivid in her young girlhood, when she's played by Jennifer Connelly, who's so clear-eyed she walks away with the 20s passages, the role of the adult Deborah is taken over by Elizabeth McGovern, who's classically miscast. McGovern's hairstyle is ferocious, she's unflatteringly photographed, and she moves like a woman who has never got used to being tall. She looks dispirited, and the flair she shows in her comedy roles isn't visible. She's so bad you feel sorry for her. She's also the victim of a glitch in the film's time scheme. Deborah goes off to Hollywood in 1933, and then we learn in 1968 that she's now a big star. McGovern's inability to live up to the idea that she's De Niro's great love weakens the film's showpiece romantic sequence, set in a vast Art Deco oceanfront restaurant on Long Island, a restaurant that is closed for the season but that Noodles has rented for the evening, with a full staff and a dance orchestra. The scene is meant to reveal Noodles' yearning nature. It's clear that Leone was thinking about Gatsby and Lost Dreams. The other actresses fare much better. Tuesday Weld is in peak form as a nympho moll who becomes Max's girl. She isn't doing that anomic acting that made her tedious in films like Play It As It Lays and Who'll Stop the Rain. She looks great, and she has a gleam of perversity. She brings the film some snap and humor, and Woods has his best scene when he's elated at showing the other guys how little she means to him. It may be the best scene he has ever played. And, as a young woman that Noodles takes up with, Darla Anflegel is Art Deco incarnate, streamlined and blonde. She wears her sleek 30s gowns with spectacular ease. Her performance is simple and in beautiful control, and De Niro has a relaxed elegance around her. The film could have used much more of her. She sets off its architectural motifs, its arches and scallop shapes. Unlike westerns, where everything is even literally out in the open, gangster movies have a special appeal. We want to know more about the concealed lives of these hidden outlaws, and how they work. That was part of the excitement of the Godfather pictures, the fullness of the crime family details. Leone doesn't have enough interest in the real world to make the gang's dealings with bigger mobs and its union tie-ins even halfway intelligible. That's a real disappointment. You can't figure out the logistics of the crimes, you don't know what's going on. What's probably going on is that Leone, with his dislocated myths, is like Noodles amid the poppy fumes. He's running old movies in his head. There's nothing in the movie to differentiate Jewish crime from Italian crime or any other kind. Leone's vision of Jewish gangsters is a joke. As a friend of mine put it, it wasn't just that you never had the feeling that they were Jewish, you never had the feeling that they were anything. The movie isn't really about America or about Jewish gangsters. But you can see why Leone was drawn to the subject. It was to create his widescreen dreamland view of the Lower East Side. That setting, filmed partly on a Brooklyn street near the waterfront, with the Williamsburg Bridge in the background, partly in Montreal, and partly on constructed sets in Rome, made it possible for him to transmute the Lower East Side settings of American gangster films to give the genre a richer, more luxuriant visual texture. It's typical of Leone's grandiloquent style that the opium den, in the back room of a Chinese theater, is sumptuous and large. And the Long Island restaurant that we see is impossibly lyrical and grand. The building is actually the Excelsior Hotel in Venice. it has to be archetypal for Leone, and it has to have an aura. Even though some of what he shows you defies common sense, visually he justifies his lust for the largest scale imaginable. He uses deep focus to draw details from the backgrounds into your awareness. The film is drenched in atmosphere, and you see more and more in the wide frames. You see howlers, too. One of my favorites is the gang storing its booty of $1 million in a locker in Grand Central in the 20s and Noodles going to retrieve it in the 30s. But I imagine that if anybody had explained to Leone that those lockers were cleared every 72 hours, he'd have brushed the fact aside as mere realism. Just about all the incidents, including the palatial rented restaurant and the loot in the locker, echo scenes in Hollywood's gangster movies. There's the heart tugger. The youngest and littlest member of the gang is the first to be killed. There's the black humor gag. Max drives a hearse to pick up Noodles at the penitentiary gates, with a hooker who's ready and waiting stowed in a coffin. About all that's missing is that Noodles, being Jewish, doesn't have a boyhood friend who becomes a priest. Leone reworks the old scenes and embroiders on them. Our group of gangsters meet Tuesday Weld, and Noodles rapes her, in the course of an out-of-town robbery, when they're wearing hankies over their faces. When they encounter her again in New York, they reintroduce themselves by tying their hankies on their faces. The fellows ask her to guess which one raped her, and they unzip. Once Upon a Time in America was the most hard-fought film of Sergio Leone's career. He turned his attention towards adapting Harry Gray's partially autobiographical mobster novel The Hoods at the very beginning of the 1970s, but a combination of rights issues, financing, and the sheer damn scope of the thing meant that 13 years had passed since Duck, You Sucker before the director premiered his seventh and final credited feature in 1984. That's a practically Malachian gap between features. For comparison, only 12 years separated Duck, You Sucker from Leone's first, uncredited work as a director on the last days of Pompeii. The result is certainly grand, a recreation of three different periods in New York's history that serves as the backdrop for a story of friendship, loyalty, success, violence, and love. That it was meant to be the culmination of Leone's career is obvious from the title, a clear echo of Once Upon a Time in the West, and when we recall as well the fact that Leone favored Once Upon a Time. The revolution as a title for Duck, You Sucker, it turns into the final act of a trilogy detailing how history is born of blood and corruption, though to be honest I can't say that the link between the three films is nearly as obvious to me as Leone apparently thought it was. I will confess to finding it a whole lot of effort in the service of not very much. Once Upon a Time in America is handsomely mounted beyond a shadow of a doubt, but as the final statement in the man's career, it mostly makes me think of how fantastic his westerns were. Part of it, undoubtedly, is its awe-inspiring running time of 229 minutes, already a compromise from the director's preferred 269-minute cut * and a solid hour and a half longer than the 139-minute version that premiered in the US. To befuddled criticism that the movie made no damn sense, the rest of the world got to see the 229-minute version right from the get-go. It doesn't not earn that running time. I'd rather rewatch Once Upon a Time in America right this second than the 20 hours of Ben-Hur ever again, but a whole lot of that not quite 4 hours is given over to atmosphere and making sure the plot has plenty of room to breathe, which I favor in principle, though in this case there are a few nips and tucks that couldn't possibly have hurt the thing overly. Put simply, this is the story of David Noodles Aronson, Robert De Niro, who as a young teenager on the Lower East Side in 1923, played in this setting by Scott Tyler, a remarkable approximation of a young De Niro, formed a gang with 4 of his friends and went to prison after avenging the death of one of his own at the hands of the established mobster they were hoping to supplant. 10 years later, Noodles is released to find that his buddy Max, James Woods, has built quite a crime empire in the meantime, and there's a space for Noodles in the gang right where he left it. He settles himself back in and enjoys the life of a successful gangster in the waning days of Prohibition, reconnecting with his childhood flame Deborah Jelly, Elizabeth McGovern as an adult, first-time actress Jennifer Connelly as a kid, and helping to worm the gang's way into the life of union activist James Conway O'Donnell. At some point, though, everything goes sour, and I won't say what, on account of we know long before it happens that it's going to happen, for a healthy portion of the movie takes place in 1968, where an aging Noodles returns to New York City for the first time in decades on business that he himself doesn't quite understand, though it has called to mind memories of his 3 comrades, all of whom died back in 1933. The most fascinating element of the script, which was the product of 6 Italian writers including Leone, before Stuart Kaminsky came along and rendered the whole thing in English, is, to me, its chronological dislocation. There are 2 primary ways to understand the narrative flow, and neither one of them involves the film proceeding in a straightforward way. We might call these the memory camp and the hallucination camp. In the first, 61-year-old Noodles, in 1968, is recalling his life in a more or less ordered way with a few significant exceptions. In the later, 26-year-old Noodles is recalling a muddy version of his past and imagining or dreaming or previsioning his future from an opium den later in the day of the event that killed his 3 friends. I prefer the latter. The structure of the opening and closing scenes all but demand it, and in particular the opening scene doesn't fit if the fixed point in history we're proceeding from is meant to be 1968, though it could be countered that what Leone is doing is depriving us of any fixed point in history, making the film's chronological ambiguity even more complete. In both cases, the story is filtered through the perceptions of a wholly unreliable narrator, which is, to me, the second most fascinating element of the script. It is an act of personal myth-making, in a genre which is frequently and not unreasonably criticized for mythologizing sociopaths and brutes and the worst sort of criminal, i.e., The Godfather, and the way it makes us sympathize with the objectively evil Vito Corleone. Or for that matter, in contrast to Leone's own act of myth-revising in his westerns, which are collectively as guilty as any movies ever have been of turning violence into poetic abstraction. Once Upon a Time in America is, in a foggy sort of way, a counter-myth that attacks the nostalgic, honorable gangsters of pop culture since the 30s as the self-serving invention of thieves and murderers. I say foggy, because the movie itself doesn't necessarily insist on this reading. What is undeniable is that the film is considerably less abstract than any of Leone's westerns. Between Carlo Simi's obsessively detailed sets and Gabriella Pescucci's costumes, the film takes place in an unambiguously solid world, as compared to the indifferently defined desert of even the historically anchored Once Upon a Time in the West. Even something as simple as the film format locks the movie into a grounded reality. This is the only one of Leone's films composed in the 1.85:1 aspect ratio, and the difference is profound. Techniscope, the preferred format of his glory days in the Western genre, is for vistas and sweeping grandeur. Normal old spherical film processes are too boxy and contained. The hard juxtaposition of panoramas and merciless close-ups that were one of the cornerstones of Leone's aesthetic is simply impossible in this ratio. You don't get the same size of the landscape on the one hand, and you can't focus on just the eyes on the other. There are still close-ups, of course, and still wide shots. Perhaps the most indelible image in the picture is a wide shot of the gangsters as children running across a city street, the Brooklyn Bridge looming in the background. Tonino Delle is still on hand to shoot and light the thing, and that counts for a great deal. And with Ennio Morricone providing yet another score, there was certainly not going to be a complete absence of the old-fashioned epic. In fact, after The Mission, this is his most unashamedly sprawling and overtly beautiful score of the 1980s, a swoony concoction of romantic strings with a single persistent flute melody in a piercing minor key to remind us of the man who years earlier had turned the sun-baked desert into rattling, urgent music. But it is still primarily an intimate movie, and this intimate focus makes certain demands for more refined characters. I do not know that the film lives up to this. Despite the best efforts of an ace cast, De Niro acquits himself well without ever making us believe that he's Jewish, and the film is oddly insistent on pointing out, frequently, that this is a Jewish mob, with Best in Show honors going to Connolly and McGovern playing the two ages of Deborah, like De Niro/Tyler, and indeed everyone else. The casting agent did a magnificent job of matching up people with the right look. It's just as well that the best acting in the film comes in the form of a woman, because outside of that nicety, Once Upon a Time in America is a massively distressing film. Leone was at all points an exceptionally masculine director, but he goes a bit overboard in this case. Noodles rapes not one but two women, the second one presented with a galling lack of shame as a tragic event for him, because it means he loses his one true love. The other woman turns out to be a nymphomaniac of some manner, played with impeccable blandness by Tuesday Weld, and the only other female character of any importance is a teenage whore who turns into a jolly middle-aged whore who brags about being fat. The simple answer to all of this is that the film is entirely aligned to Noodles' perspective, and in his mind, all women are whores, and his rape of Deborah is a bitter loss to him. Which is a fine point to make, but it's not clear that the movie really cares if we make it or not, insofar as we are meant to understand that Noodles is a dysfunctional person. It's because of the violence in his life, not the casual sexism and misogyny, and Leone appears to be either unaware or unconcerned that he's allowed such a pervasive and ugly current into his movie. But I was referring to, was I not, the film's intimacy with its characters, following along as Noodles and his friends grow up and inhabit their lives first as children, then as young adults with too much money. It's for this reason that the film had to be almost 4 hours long, I gather, to relax us into the world of the characters and let us see them at length so we get to know them as the old friends that they feel like. It works, as far as that goes, though I still think a 3-hour Once Upon a Time in America could accomplish the same goals. But no matter. The film as it exists is a good, solid, beautiful-looking piece of myth and counter-myth, and it certainly has the weight of a final statement. It ends Leone's career in as satisfying a way as it was likely to end, I guess, and while it strikes me as a bit too chilly and fussed over, though I find the encomiums of its most urgent fans rather perplexing, if it does anything that The Godfather, Part 2 didn't do better, I'm at a loss to explain what that might be. It cannot be doubted that all of the ambition shows up on screen. It is one hell of a monumental movie, in every sense of that word, for better or worse. I am not fascinated, as you say, by the myth of the West, or by the myth of the gangster. I am not hypnotized, like everyone east of New York and west of Los Angeles, by the mythical notions of America. I'm talking about the individual, and the endless horizon El Dorado. I believe that cinema, except in some very rare and outstanding cases, has never done much to incorporate these ideas. And if you think about it, America itself has never made much of an effort in that direction either. But there is no doubt that cinema, unlike political democracy, has done what it can. Just consider Easy Rider, Taxi Driver, Scarface, or Rio Bravo. I love the vast spaces of John Ford and the metropolitan claustrophobia of Martin Scorsese, the alternating petals of the American daisy. America speaks like fairies in a fairy tale. You desire the unconditional, then your wishes are granted. But in a form you will never recognize. My movie making plays games with these parables. I appreciate sociology all right, but I am still enchanted by fables, especially by their dark side. I think, in any case, that my next film won't be another American fable. But I say that here and I deny it here, too. Once Upon a Time in America is my best film, bar none, I swear, and I knew that it would be from the moment I got Harry Gray's book in my hand. I'm glad I made it, even though during the filming I was as tense as Dick Tracy's jaw. It always goes like that. Shooting a film is awful, but to have made a movie is delicious. Sergio Leone, the great Italian director Sergio Leone, established himself as the inventor of the spaghetti western genre in the mid-1960s thanks to his Dollars trilogy, A Fistful of Dollars, For a Few Dollars More, and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, starring the legendary Clint Eastwood. His three following and equally adored films would become known as the Once Upon a Time trilogy and would end up spanning 3 decades. The first installment, called Once Upon a Time in the West, was released in 1968, the second one, Duck, You Sucker, came out 3 years later in 1971, and the last one, titled Once Upon a Time in America, took him over a decade to make. During the 1960s, the director read the part memoir, part fiction novel The Hoods, written by Harry Gray, a former Russian-American gangster whose real name was Herschel Goldberg, and who, although hesitant at first, agreed to meet with Leone, only because he had seen and liked his westerns. During their meeting, the director asked the not all too communicative Gray/Goldberg questions about his real-life experiences, to which the author only gave short answers, which was understandable due to his former lifestyle and the inevitable, justifiable paranoia that accompanied it. The two met several more times during the 1960s and 1970s, with Leone intending to understand the author's perception of America better. Leone became so obsessed with turning the source material into a movie that, when approached by Paramount several years later, he even declined to make The Godfather. Little did the filmmaker know it would take him another 10 years to get his passion project made, and that it would, regrettably, be his very last one. The first draft of the movie was written by American author Norman Mailer, known for the novel The Naked and the Dead and his Marilyn Monroe biography. But the task of making a comprehensible screenplay out of the director's colossal story turned out not to be an easy one, for Leone remained thoroughly unimpressed, later on telling American Film, "I'm sorry to say, he only gave birth to a Mickey Mouse version." Mailer, at least to my eyes, the eyes of an old fan, is not a writer for movies. The shooting script was ultimately written by Italian screenwriters Leonardo Benvenuti, Piero de Bernardi, Enrico Mediola, Franco Arcoli, Franco Farini, and Leone himself. The result was a 317-page-long screenplay that was finished in 1981, with principal photography beginning on June 14, 1982 and ending on April 22, 1983. Robert De Niro was set to play the lead role, although he reportedly almost declined because the director peed on the toilet seat of the actor's New York hotel suite, which De Niro interpreted as a power play. Luckily, the producer managed to convince him to take on the role of the protagonist, called Noodles. Considered for the role of Noodles' best friend Max were Harvey Keitel, John Belushi, Dustin Hoffman, John Malkovich, and Jon Voight, until James Woods was cast. Brooke Shields was offered to play Noodles' love interest Deborah Jelly, but the part then went to Elizabeth McGovern, with a young Jennifer Connelly playing her child self. A great portion of the film was shot at the Cinecittà Studios in Rome, and several scenes were filmed in Paris, St. Petersburg, Florida, and Montreal. But the parts that were shot in the United States were as authentic as can be. The Jewish neighborhood where a bulk of the story takes place was a street in Brooklyn that had been made to look the way it did in the 1920s. It was on those streets that the main characters of Leone's movie spent their childhoods, resorting to petty crimes at first, only to progress to more serious ones as time went on. This segment of the characters' lives is presented to us in flashbacks and is meant to be seen as a collection of the main protagonist's memories. The first part of the movie sees a grown-up Noodles hiding from hitmen in an opium den and eventually leaving the city. Only after he returns 30 years later are we, the viewers, given extensive glimpses into his childhood and are acquainted with his merry band of misfits that we had thus far only known by name. Leone constantly goes back and forth in time, establishing not only the lives of his characters at different stages, but also three distinguished areas of American history: the poverty of Manhattan's Jewish ghettos in the 1920s, criminal life during the 1930 Prohibition era, and finally the dangerous streets of 1968 New York. In an interview with Marlene Glixman, Leone stated the following about the United States: "America is so varied and exciting that after 6 months, you go back and find it completely changed. America interests me above all because it is so filled with contradictions, interesting contradictions, which change constantly. Even if you've decided that you don't want to deal with that subject again, before you know it, the desire comes back to do it yet again. The world is in America. In Italy is only Italy. France is full of France. Germany is full of Germany. In a continent that contains the entire world, contradictions are, of course, constantly arising. One of these contradictions that I like to cite is that two of the biggest money-making films in America were Mary Poppins and Deep Throat. One, of course, is the opposite of the other, but most likely seen by the same public. And Leone depicts this world that is in America not just beautifully, but also realistically. For he is first and foremost an artistic genius, dedicated to detailed, intricate and deeply intimate portrayals of lives lived, friendships betrayed and dreams broken. In Once Upon a Time in America, he deals with the illusion of the American dream, as seen through the eyes of Jewish kids whose entire childhoods are drenched in poverty, with the prospect of crime being the only logical solution, for which there exist no feelings of remorse or guilt. It is a visceral depiction of toxic masculinity which still reigns supreme in today's world, showing inherently broken children rising to power through violence and corruption. It is also a painfully accurate portrayal of inexcusable misogyny which was once considered a norm, with acts of violence, sexual and otherwise, against women shown in great detail and with little to no restraint. It is also a story of a man who feels inferior to the woman he claims to love, leading him to exercise his dominance the only way he knows how and resulting in her leaving him behind to make use of her talents and build a respectable life and career for herself. Once Upon a Time in America is also a narrative about our loyalties to one another, which more often than not lead to us sacrificing our own desires, wants and needs for the sake of lifelong friendships that have become such a crucial part of our being, that giving them up would feel akin to dying. It is a story of a man who at one point comes to a forking in the road, but chooses to follow the path of least resistance and continues living the only life he has ever known, until it catches up with him. It is a tale of a human being who ends up exercising his free will and consciously choosing to believe a false narrative, so as to keep his memories intact, his self-concept alive and the life he wasted feeling remorse from crumbling before his very eyes. It is a complex and elaborately nuanced saga about the trajectories of once marginalized and impoverished people, about the guilt that accompanies betrayal, even when it is done for the purest of reasons, about the incessant passing of time that heals no wounds, when the carriers of said wounds are not looking for healing. Once Upon a Time in America requires the viewer's full-blown attention and patience, with the camera constantly zooming in and lingering on the actors' faces so as to convey as much emotional nuance as possible. The pacing is slow, but we do not mind, for it enables us to walk around in the characters' shoes and experience the passing of time that leaves none of them unburdened. It is, in short, poetry in motion. There is a story the director once told, of an Italian critic who gave his film a fistful of dollars a bad review upon its release. Then he became a fan of mine later. He went to the university here Rome with Once Upon a Time in America. We showed it to 10,000 students. And while the man was speaking that day to the students, with me present, he said, "I have to state one thing. When I gave that review about Sergio's films, I should have taken into account that on Sergio Leone's passport, there should not be written whether the nationality is Italian or anything else. What should be written is, nationality, cinema. And Once Upon a Time in America could rightfully be described as pure, unadulterated cinema with a capital C. Unfortunately, not many American viewers or critics thought so when the movie hit theaters in the summer of 1984. The reason was the severe injustice done to Leone's masterpiece by the hands of US distributors. The story goes as follows: at the end of the shoot, the director had 8 to 10 hours of material on his hands, which he and his editor Nino Baragli managed to cut down to 6, with the intention of it being released as 2 3-hour movies. But his vision seemed to be too grandiose for the producers who, given the critical and commercial failure of Bernardo Bertolucci's historical drama film 1900 that was released in 2 parts in 1976, insisted he cut the material some more. After having reduced it to a length of 4 hours and 29 minutes, 269 minutes, the producers were still nowhere near satisfied. Leone ultimately gave them a 229-minute movie that had its premiere at the Cannes Film Festival in 1984, where it received a 15-minute standing ovation, and subsequently played in European theaters. This is the version that European audiences and critics talk about when praising Once Upon a Time in America as one of the greats, a masterclass in storytelling, directing, acting, and cinematography. But American audiences were not so lucky, for what they got to see was an even shorter version of Leone's classic, a 139-minute travesty, as Roger Ebert referred to it in his review, where he compares the original he had the chance to watch in Cannes and the butchered version that was presented to the American public. This desecration of Once Upon a Time in America was done without the director's supervision and against his will, by an assistant editor who had worked on Police Academy. The version in question was not only barely comprehensible, but also ruined the cast and crew's shots at even getting nominated for the following year's Academy Awards. The movie did get 2 Golden Globe nominations though, for Best Director and Best Original Score. To make things even worse, the soundtrack provided by Leone's frequent collaborator, the incredible Italian composer Ennio Morricone, was disqualified from the Oscar consideration to begin with, because his name was omitted from the opening credits. Apart from doing Morricone's haunting score a great disservice, the 139-minute version failed on numerous other levels. In the American cut, Leone's nonlinear storytelling was abandoned for a chronological one. Scenes have been extensively left out, the ones depicting Noodle's childhood in particular. Characters that had previously not been introduced suddenly appear on screen, crucial pieces of information go missing, and the relationships between the characters seem unmotivated and unclear. Even the ending, which is considered to be one of the most ambiguous ones in the history of cinema, sparking debate and various theories decades after its original release, has been cut short and turned into a more than obvious, yet somewhat dissatisfying, conclusion. Needless to say, everything that made Once Upon a Time in America truly enchanting was sacrificed and burned at the stake, turning the cut in question into an incomprehensible train wreck severely lacking the magic needed to hold its puzzle pieces together. The director's collaborators and peers have frequently and unabashedly spoken out on the topic of the American cut, claiming that the alterations caused the filmmaker a great amount of emotional pain. And with Leone passing due to a massive heart attack several years after the movie's release, James Woods even asserted that he died of a broken heart. For one of the greatest movies about America ended up being massacred beyond compare and presented to the American people in its lesser, far inferior form. I've always had the sensation that people in America are always avant-garde, Leone told Marlene Glixman in a 1987 interview, very attentive to all the new innovations. But it's very specialized. The American public is a very specialized public. The reason it is taken as a realistic film is because inside the fable, I put that kind of reality in. And it could easily be called, instead of Once Upon a Time in America, Once Upon a Time There Was a Certain Kind of Cinema. Because it was also an homage to cinema. And there's my pessimism. Because I didn't know yet that type of film is always going to become more extinct, that there won't be any more. Because there will always be more films that win 5 Oscars like Terms of Endearment. Luckily, efforts would later be made to restore the 269-minute version that even European audiences did not get to see. It was announced in 2011 that the director's original cut was to be recreated in an Italian film lab and that the process would be supervised by Fausto Ancilli, the movie's original sound editor, and Leone's children, who had the Italian distribution rights. But due to unexpected legal issues regarding certain deleted scenes, the cut ended up being 251 minutes long. This restored version premiered at the Cannes Film Festival in 2012 thanks to the efforts of Martin Scorsese, whose Film Foundation assisted with the restoration, which is now available on DVD/Blu-ray. Meaning that the movie can finally be viewed as it was meant to, with the ambiguous ending remaining intact and open to as much interpretation as ever. Was Max's implied fate what had really come to pass? James Woods himself cannot be sure, for the director did not tell and even used a stand-in to shoot the scene in question. Or was the entire movie just an opium-induced dream of Noodles, with the past being something he vividly remembered and the future that which he envisioned, so as to alleviate the guilt he felt for the actions he took? Leone himself did not oppose this theory, but rather confirmed that it just might be the case. Whatever his true intentions were, it is safe to say that the Italian auteur's swan song will remain one of the most important chapters in the history of American cinema. Fairy tales are lovely things. They provide us with simple explanations for how the world works, little comforts before we fall asleep, ready to dream of all the beautiful things to come. The final shot of Once Upon a Time in America shows its central character, Noodles, Robert De Niro, lying down beneath a thin sheet as he's about to be served opium in a den in 1933. The last thing we see is his confident smile that everything will work out. He might be down on his luck, but he did a good thing, which makes it all right. The viewer, having made their way through this 4+ hour runtime, knows better. We have seen the beautiful and horrible things that have been and are to come for Noodles, and that smile cuts through us. It doesn't symbolize joy, it represents a profound tragic ignorance and decades of pain and confusion to come. Sergio Leone's final film, Once Upon a Time in America, is his only gangster movie, based on the novel The Hoods, which he'd been trying to adapt since the 1960s. Told across 3 points in time, 1918, 1933, and 1968, we follow David Noodles Aronson, a Jewish-American boy who forms a street gang with his friends, spends over a decade in prison, gets out to find his friends have built something more significant, and then loses it all by the time he's an old man. This is not the story of a good person or someone who didn't deserve to have it all taken away. Noodles is a horrible person, a vulgar brute and rapist. He deserves to lose, but that doesn't make the trajectory of his life less tragic or painful to watch. Leone understands that every violent monster was a baby, a child once, and that we don't have to praise them, but we do need to understand them. If we hope to make a world where children are not ground up into these kinds of base killers, we need to know how they get there. No one is born evil. The most critical relationship in Noodles' life is with Max, James Woods. The two meet as boys, played by Scott Tyler and Rusty Jacobs in 1918. The movie's central love story is between these two characters, and you can feel the hunger grow between them as time passes. There's an intense scene of the two as adults poolside, their respective malls lounging behind them. Noodles and Max face each other, and Max talks intensely about his plans for an upcoming robbery, emphasizing how this will allow him and Noodles to be free. There's no thought or mention of the women they are with because they are disposable. Their true loves are each other, and all their passions lie in their bond. They fuck women, but they love each other. This doesn't excuse how we see them treat women, but it is essential to understand what happens between these two men. But let's talk about the elephant in the room. Let's talk about Deborah. As a young girl, Deborah, Jennifer Connelly, is the object of Noodles' fantasies. There's a hole in the bathroom wall of her family's deli where Noodles will watch her practice her ballet dancing. She is keenly aware that he is watching and playfully teases him, a game of young love going back and forth. When Noodles finally tries to talk to her about how he feels, it's incoherent. Deborah stops him. She lays out that she could never be with someone who is ultimately a two-bit thug, that Noodles has chosen a life for himself that she can't live with, and so they will never be anything. She's entirely correct. Women who end up with men like Noodles don't have pristine life stories, they always end in tragedy one way or the other. Over a decade later, Noodles is released after murdering a cop and reunited with his old pals. Deborah is also there, and we are unsure if something will be rekindled between them. However, before they have their beautiful moment under the moonlight, Noodles takes part in a diamond robbery aided in part by Carol, Tuesday Weld, a sex worker who also works in the jewelers where the diamonds are held. The gang has to convince the jeweler that Carol is not in on the heist, so Noodles rapes her to make sure the story is believed. It's a shocking moment but not filmed in a way that betrays Leone's own perspective. He just films the moment and lets us sit with that. It's never directly addressed by anyone in the scene or even Carol. Later, she shows up as Max's moll, yet she and Noodles never talk about the rape. That's important to note as we go back to talk about Deborah. Noodles and Deborah go on a lavish date, and she talks about her dreams of going to Hollywood and becoming a famous performer. They sit by a river under the moonlight as Ennio Morricone's gorgeous score plays. I was watching this in complete awe of the beauty Leone could present on the screen. This felt like two human beings connecting, a love being born. This was something good in Noodles' life. But Leone is not a fool. It's in his title, Once Upon a Time. Life is a fairy tale, a falsehood, a pose obscuring America's nasty truth. On the limousine ride home, Noodles brutally rapes Deborah. It's just a kiss, an embrace, but then, like an animal, he just savages her. We are made to sit through the scene absent that beautiful score, just the sounds of Noodles' heavy breathing and Deborah's screams and cries in protest. The car stops, Noodles exits, lights a cigarette. We know he knows he's a fucked up person, but it's too late. He destroyed whatever beauty had existed between them. Noodles offers the driver cash to drive Deborah home, and the man rejects the money but takes her away regardless. Noodles continues his late night by seeking a brothel and bedding down for the night with a sex worker whom he lets tag along for a while. Viewers with good memories will note this is the same woman murdered in the film's opening scene as the mob is hunting for Noodles. When Morricone's score returns, it doesn't hit us with the same sense of beauty. This time, it's a mournful tragedy. It's a beautiful note played against the ugliest of tableaus that evokes a sense of painful sadness and sorrow. As Noodles' life unravels further, as his plans to protect Max seemingly fail to happen, he retreats further into confusion. How he'd thought you lived life to be a success isn't working out. Growing up, he'd seen that you would eventually get to the top if you brutalized and bullied your way along. That's the way the other gangs operated. Hell, the police functioned practically the same. Manipulating a cop is how the crew got things off the ground in 1918 in the first place. If you are an American, as I am, however, living outside of the country, you are subject to a very coercive and effective system of propaganda from the moment of your birth. The messages about society and individuality are blasted into your brain every waking moment, from what you see in the news to the emphasis on merit-based success and bootstrap ideology, devotion and adherence to clearly broken institutions. If you just fuck over enough people, you, too, can be a winner. You see it in the praise of billionaires as financial geniuses rather than lucky by birth, duplicitous exploiters. The worst I've seen, especially as a teacher, is how this system of social education affects immigrants. So many Southeast Asian and Latin immigrants guzzle down these lies because they are so desperate to assimilate, and this grind set is how society appears to function. The country is a meat grinder, and its citizens are divided into two class-centric groups, the wealthy, turning the crank, and the rest of us, who get turned into dog food. The tragedy is that we future cans of Alpo are so effectively convinced to turn on each other, fighting to be the first one at the top of a pile of corpses. Noodles is an objectively abhorrent character, and his rape of Deborah cements his status. I could not forgive him, but I still ached at that final scene. Leone isn't going to just write people off as nothing. The tragedy comes from those childhood years when the movie is filmed with this sense of awe about New York City, the feeling that something magical could happen. That is the fairy tale of this story. The further we move along through time, the less pretty things become, even the lighting becomes darker, more noirish. Leone tells us the story of how immigrants got caught up in the fantasy of this time and how it destroyed them in the end. All the money, the violence, and the women you could fuck, whether they wanted it or not, amounts to nothing. You just hurt people struggling just like you, and it got you nowhere. You cannot argue that Noodles, Max, and friends are bootlickers. They rightfully hate cops, but they are too blinded to see that the path they've chosen instead doesn't end with them coming out any better than those who stringently follow the system. In fact, organized crime was made a part of the system. The police are state-sponsored organized crime, the mob is an independent contractor. I've seen some reviews on Twitter and Letterboxd where it's clear the person did not get what Leone was doing here. They are so fixated on the act of rape that they fail to understand why it is in the movie. Leone was as mad as they were about Noodles raping Deborah. People who like this movie feel the same anger. However, you have to understand this is a piece of art and the presentation of a criminal act in art is not an endorsement of the action. You can tell Leone finds nothing beautiful about it in how he films it. A subset of Americans is increasingly demanding puritanical art obscuring our lives' cruel truth. I don't fault anyone for wanting to indulge in fantasy. Hell, the majority of what's playing in cineplexes across the country is escapist garbage that either has no connection to what people are experiencing in their material reality or pieces of poorly hidden propaganda that seek to reinstill conformity in the masses. They may present diverse faces, but the themes and intent of the art are still as sinister and nasty as ever. Once Upon a Time in America is a better film in its portrayal of organized crime than The Godfather and the gangster movies it inspired. I don't dislike The Godfather. It is one of the best movies ever made, but so is this. Leone's final film is a tragic romance, deconstructing the dense myths America built up about these criminal figures. He is saying that if you live by these principles, you will die a friendless, miserable, old piece of shit. No one in the movie gets a happy ending. Hell, one of the last times we see a central character are his limbs getting ground up in a trash compactor. If you walk away thinking Leone doesn't view these characters as harshly as you, then it speaks to a profound lack of literacy in the culture than it does the filmmaker's work. This picture is a condemnation of America, shared through tears and a sense that it didn't have to be like this. These children didn't need to become these broken old men. But, they just followed the few paths before them as immigrants in a country that has always harbored a seething hatred for new arrivals while assigning themselves some sort of divine right to exist in the space. Once Upon a Time in America should linger with you, it should be something you cannot get out of your head, and the outcome of that contemplation should be on ways we can make a world where children do not get locked into suicidal lives before they get a chance to understand who they are and could be. If it's true, as Sir Christopher Frayling claims in his seminal book on Sergio Leone, Something to Do with Death, the director stated that he really just wanted to make fairy tales for grown ups. A film buff to the core and a child of the silver screen, his parents worked in the Italian film industry, paving the way for his own emergence in the system. Leone seems to have been granted his movie magical wish. Boasting one of the most successful filmmaking careers in his own country, if not all countries, Sergio Leone became a more than a director. He became an aesthetic, a style, an attitude on screen. He didn't make many movies, but when he did, he gave them his all the soul, all the vision, all the violent panache. Late in his own story, Leone's career as an auteur of the operatic grew in stature as it stalled out in necessary financial support. He wanted to make Once Upon a Time in America, a mighty magnum opus of crime in Prohibition-era USA. It took him at least a decade to realize this dream. The result is a sweeping, non-linear epic of memory from the increasingly unsympathetic point of view of a man who only ever knew how to live for himself. Do I mean the film's main character, or the director? Definitely, and quite apparently. Is it possible for a film to bear both an overbearing, seasoned brutal streak, and maintain an innocent twinkle in its eye? Over the course of its exhausting and exhilarating epic runtime of nearly 4 hours, this review stems from the 229-minute cut, made available on DVD in 2003, Once Upon a Time in America manages to walk this impossible line. The film bears all the markings of a nostalgic memory of a life never lived, in a place one has never been. Yet, a hyper-present sense of unrepentant guilt hangs over the entire affair, like the unshakable mists of a memory/dream. Robert De Niro plays one of his most sensitive but hardened and violent characters yet, a lifelong gangster called Noodles, based quite loosely on Harry Gray's own life as told in his novel The Hoods. On the tide of Prohibition, Noodles and his boyhood crew of criminal ne'er-do-wells rise to underworld prominence in Lower East Manhattan. Their lives of opulence, guns, liquor, and prostitutes is a classic inward celebration of the self, pleasures seemingly accepted as the ointment necessary in dealing with the isolation, rejection, and fear that they breed around them. As Noodles flash forwards from his early 1930s heyday to his life and times as a lonely old man in the 1960s, set to composer Ennio Morricone's piercing strains of the Beatles' Yesterday, he seeks a resolution to his lingering threads of the past. After nearly 4 hours of ambiguous bursts of violence, including but not limited to murder and prolonged, horrific rape committed by our protagonist, Leone has the gumption to leave things strangely unresolved, mysteriously so. Was it all some kind of fairy tale fever dream? An opium-induced string of regrets denied and love lost? Seemingly, yes. Waishia is a film as lavishly ornate in its period recreation as it is sickeningly brutal. Particularly in the beginning, blood and disfigurement are liberally present. Through it all, Ennio Morricone's score is one of his most magnificent, and the cast is spot on all the while. James Woods plays Maxie, Noodles' literal partner in crime, running a speakeasy business behind the front of undertaking. Elizabeth McGovern is Noodles' unobtainable object of desire. Her less than fully humanized role in his story dates back to early years flashbacks when her character is played by a young Jennifer Connelly, dancing in a dusty back room while young Noodles peeps longingly through a hole in the wall. Strictly speaking, only a director who sufficiently overthought this material would consider it a fairy tale. On the surface, and even deeper, it's a lot of other things. First, a crime film, a masculine drama, a coming-of-age picture, an old man's lament, a period epic, etc. Yet, Once Upon a Time in America fits the fairy tale movie parameters better than so many other Leone films. More so than the commentary on America that some may expect, it's Leone's own commentary on himself, and an uneasy one at that. Without having fully studied Leone, or having finished Frayling's celebrated book about him, it's safe to say that although Waishia bears all of the markings of the years gestating passion project that it is, it's not his masterpiece. That honor will always belong to his other fairy tale titled pastiche, Once Upon a Time in the West. Waishia rambles, shambles, and just keeps getting longer. Since this thoroughly extended version surfaced, an even longer cut has become available. But, it wears its patina of dusty, sepia-like memory well. The film is admirable but difficult, likely best left avoided by a good portion of the film-going populace, due to some extremely disturbing moments and actions. It does, of course, have its vocal fans, and their admiration should not be denied. There at least seems to be more happening externally with these characters than later in the film when they're adults, where they seem a bit more stiff and subdued. It is these childhood moments that offer some of the film's more arresting moments, even if they are focused on nothing more than a young child resisting eating a dessert. A great portion of this cinematic prowess is due to Ennio Morricone's sublime score, one that shifted away from the masculine and hard-skinned twangs of his work for Leone's classic spaghetti westerns, one that evoked a more worldly and majestical mood. Another example of why Once Upon a Time in America is so memorable is the transitions between timelines, the 20s, 30s, and 60s, which certainly appear as if they had a lot of Leone's careful hands constructing them in the most perfect manner. The slow build up to each transition, with the camera honing in on the characters' faces and the music that swells up, instills a powerful sense of magic in how this film plays with time and memory. It's Leone proving how cinema can display the passages of time better than any other art form. I had the pleasure recently of seeing this film in its entirety at the cinemas, where I was planted on the cinema seat for the good part of 4 hours, absorbed and soaked up by this absolute craft of a film whose scope really puts the majority of other films to shame. Not only was I watching the original European cut, but it also contained a few deleted scenes scattered seamlessly throughout, though oddly enough, displayed a huge drop in quality of both picture and sound, given how these materials obviously weren't sourced from any reliable master. Some of the deleted scenes seemed to just drag the storyline out even further, such as an extended sequence of elderly Noodles at the mausoleum of his friends or towards the end of the film when Max, James Woods, explains even more of his ultimatum. Some other deleted scenes seem to work in favor of the film and have you wondering why Leone cut them out, such as a rather dramatic explosion from a car that had been following Noodles, or the adult gangster friends swimming about in the water after Noodles drive their car off a jetty, which transitions through time better in the cut, or a scene of an older Deborah, Elizabeth McGovern, giving a dramatic performance on stage. Not that a scene like this moves the story a whole lot forward at all, but it's nonetheless a riveting story within a story sequence whose theatrical boldness matches that of the rest of the film. It's curious to see the diverse range of films that have adopted the Once Upon a Time title: Once Upon a Time in China, 1991, Once Upon a Time in Mexico, 2003, Once Upon a Time in Anatolia, 2011, and of course Quentin Tarantino's Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, 2019, a filmmaker who wears his Leone fanboyness on his sleeves. But Once Upon a Time in America stands as the ultimate testament to the American way of making business, making friends, making enemies, and making love. It's a country a number of its citizens love and hate equally, and this towering epic sums up that grand, ever-expanding feeling. This film, directed by Sergio Leone, screenplay by Leonardo Benvenuti, dialogue by Stuart Kaminsky, based on The Hoods, produced by Arnon Milchan, starring Robert De Niro, cinematography Tonino Delicali, edited by Nino Baragli, music by Ennio Morricone, production companies The Lad Company, distributed by Warner Brothers. Release dates May 23, 1984. Running time 229 minutes. Countries United States. Languages English. Budget $30 million. Box office $5.5 million.